In the early 1850s, the northern regions of the Louisiana Purchase Territory were still unorganized. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas proposed a plan to organize the region. Douglas wanted settlers to move into the territory and to pave the way for the construction of a transcontinental railroad, a railroad which would pass through his home state of Illinois. At issue, however, was the fact that this territory was north of the Missouri Compromise line, meaning any territories carved out of this land would have a prohibition on slavery. Douglas knew his plans to organize the territories would not receive the Southern support he needed in order to get them passed. So in January of 1854, Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The act created two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, who would determine the slavery issue in their territories through popular sovereignty. President Franklin Pierce and Southern congressmen supported his bill. However, Northern Democrats and Whigs refused to support the bill. But with the support of President Pierce, the Kansas-Nebraska Act did pass. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act resulted in a population boom in Kansas, as both anti-slavery and pro-slavery supporters flooded the state in order to influence the vote on Kansas's status regarding slavery. Pro-slavery supporters had the advantage as Kansas shared a border with slave state Missouri. As the 1855 election rolled around, nearly 5,000 people from Missouri, known as border ruffians, crossed the border in order to influence the election. Border ruffians came armed and controlled the election through intimidation and illegal voting. As a result, the pro-slavery supporters overwhelmingly won the election. The pro-slavery segment immediately established a government and went about proposing a pro-slavery constitution known as the Lecompton Constitution. The Constitution was presented to Congress with a proposal for statehood. Although Democratic President James Buchanan supported the request, Illinois Congressman Stephen Douglas and Northern Democrats opposed the request, and Kansas would not receive the statehood it requested. Part of the reason for Kansas's denial to statehood was the presence of an opposing government in the territory. Slavery opponents held their own elections, created their own government, and drafted their own constitution, which specifically outlawed slavery. The result of these two governments was essentially a civil war in Kansas between pro- and anti-slavery groups. The violent struggle, in which approximately 200 people died, became known as Bleeding Kansas. Congress held heated debates on the events happening in Kansas as well. On May 19th through 20th of 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a rousing speech entitled "The Crime Against Kansas." In his speech, Sumner spoke against the efforts to extend slavery into Kansas and specifically spoke harshly of South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler. 2 days later, Sumner was approached in the Senate chamber by South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks, who was the cousin of Andrew Butler. Having waited for the Senate chamber to clear, Brooks approached Sumner. When Sumner rose from his seat, Brooks struck Sumner with a gold-capped cane and went about beating the fallen senator. The cane eventually broke in the course of the assault. Sumner survived the attack, and Brooks was arrested, though he was later re-elected in a large part due to the approval of his attack. To the South, Preston Brooks was a hero who stood up to a Northern senator. To Northerners, Charles Sumner became a martyr for the abolitionist cause. The slavery issue led to the development of new political parties. In 1848, the Free Soil Party was formed. The party was opposed to slavery. Their slogan was "Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men." The party, however, made very little impact until it joined with Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats. Between 1854 and 1856, the Free Soil Party and the anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats united to form the Republican Party. The party was initially formed to oppose government policies that allowed slavery to be spread. In the 1856 presidential election, the Republicans nominated John C. Fremont of California. Fremont had very little political experience, but was a well-known and popular figure from the Mexican-American War. The Democrats nominated James Buchanan. Although Buchanan won some northern states, he won mostly due to his support in the South. With the growing sectional tensions on both sides threatening to boil over, Buchanan would prove to be too indebted to Southern support and too much of a weak leader. Many historians consider Buchanan one of the, if not the worst, president in United States history for his policies, which at best did not slow down the oncoming Civil War, and at worst actually hastened the war's onset. In March 1857, the Supreme Court announced one of its most controversial decisions in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was a slave who had been moved by his owner from the state of Missouri to Illinois, a free state, and then from Illinois to the Wisconsin Territory. Wisconsin was a free territory due to the Missouri Compromise. Scott would eventually sue for his freedom, claiming that because he had been moved into a free state and then later a territory, that he should be given his freedom. In the court's Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney made the following rulings. Dred Scott was not a U.S. citizen and therefore had no right to sue. Had Taney left the decision at that, controversy probably would not have occurred. Because he had no right to sue, therefore you don't need to rule on the rest of the case. However, Taney instead decided to actually rule on the case and provide an actual ruling to a case that he said had no right to even be tried. Because Taney here wanted to resolve the slavery issue through the Supreme Court. So Taney continued by ruling that because Scott was a slave, he was property and therefore not a person. Therefore, the property rights of the owner had to be respected. The owner's property rights were not lost simply because they crossed state borders. Finally, Congress had no right to limit slavery to certain areas of the country. This actually did completely make the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. So essentially, the Supreme Court here opened up slavery to the entire country, at least in regards to blocking any federal laws that limited where slavery could be held. Instead, it would be up to the states and up to the territories. So the South celebrated the ruling, while for many in the North, it was evidence of a growing bias by the President and Congress and the Supreme Court of this growing bias in favor of Southern slave power. 5 of the Supreme Court justices were first from the Southern states. And President Buchanan was said to have actually pressured Northern Justice Robert Cooper Greer into siding with these Southern judges in order to prevent any appearance of sectional divisions on the court. However, despite his goal to resolve the slavery issue, Chief Justice Taney's ruling actually helped push the country closer to war. The Dred Scott decision established that every state could decide their stance on the slavery issue without any intervention from the national government. The court's decision sparked debates nationwide and played a great role in the 1858 debates between Illinois Senate candidates Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. Douglas was one of the leading Democratic senators. The Little Giant, as he was known, was a strong supporter of popular sovereignty and was the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Lincoln was one of the founders of the Republican Party and had previously only served one term in the House of Representatives. Lincoln's stance on slavery, and specifically the Dred Scott decision, was laid out in his famous House Divided speech. In the speech, Lincoln proclaimed, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I expressed this belief a year ago, and subsequent developments have but confirmed me. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and put it in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all states, old as well as new." Douglas, however, was put in a difficult position. As the main supporter of popular sovereignty, he couldn't oppose the Dred Scott decision, as the case paved the way for state choice on slavery. However, the decision clearly favored the spread of slavery, something which Douglas, as a Northern Democrat, could not support. Douglas presented his middle ground during one of his debates with Lincoln. His compromise was known as the Freeport Doctrine. The Freeport Doctrine stated that the people living in a territory or state should have the right to choose to have slavery or not, and then be able to reject any legislation put forward by their state that went against the people's choice. After 7 debates, predominantly all about slavery, the election for Senate was held. Douglas was reelected to the Senate. However, Lincoln had established himself as a national political figure.